Hey, how's everybody doing this morning? Welcome back to another exciting episode of the conference. So again, we had a great day yesterday. A lot of good conversations, a lot of good discussions. I really appreciate everyone for participating, what we all do on behalf of all the organizers. Today is our last day, so and we'll get it going with panel 6. So we've talked a lot about how things come together, what everybody's needs are, and we're going to kind of give a shine today to our early career folks as well as our industry and research folks as we try to balance this thing out to what I think is one of the most important pieces, which is mitigation. So as climate change waves on, we must figure out how we're going to live with that thing. And so one of the goals of today is to discuss the current and future approaches to reducing the infrastructure vulnerability. And so how we do this is we're looking through like system hardening, advanced detection technologies, equitable emergency load balance strategies, such as many things that folks have already spoke about. This is kind of what the goals are in this particular session. And so understanding these current and future mitigation strategies is going to be key, especially to our satellite assets, as well as satellite data that we have coming from those assets and how they can support these efforts. So without further ado, we're going to introduce our first esteemed speaker, Sofia Taylor.
Help me find Perfect. Oh, okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Sofia Taylor. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm also a member of the Energy Analysis and Policy Program. I'm advised by Dr. Lena Rold at UW, and I'm also in the same research group as Noah Rhodes, who spoke yesterday. I've also worked a bit with Ahmed, who spoke yesterday as well. And today I'll just be giving kind of like a high-level overview of my research at UW, and then I think this will be kind of like a good intro into this mitigation subject, and then the utilities that are speaking next can kind of dive deeper into some of the things that they're doing. Okay, cool, thank you. Okay, so I think the first step in mitigating the risk of igniting wildfires is accurately assessing the risk of power lines igniting wildfires. And I should just note that in a lot of our research, we've focused mainly on the risk of power lines starting wildfires rather than existing wildfires damaging power lines. So Noah, I think yesterday gave a great introduction and motivation to this subject. So I'll kind of dive right into, kind of the next steps here. So we're currently using wildfire potential maps to quantify the potential of, or quantify the risk of each power line in the power system in starting a wildfire. And so we've kind of thought about this risk as a function of the probability of an electric fault occurring, and then the impact of like a potential ignition leading to a fire. And this first part, the probability of an electric fault, is really hard to assess because it's a very low probability event. So while there are a lot of fires that are, or a lot of ignitions that are where the source is a power line, the probability of an ignition happening at one particular place at one particular time is very, very low. So that's hard to assess, but we can use information about the power system to get a sense for that. So for example, we could estimate that distribution lines are about 3 times as likely to have a fault occur as compared with transmission lines. Then the impact piece, that's where we're taking these wildfire potential maps and quantifying the potential for if there is an ignition, what are the chances that it would spread to a large fire and spread quickly. So this Wildland Fire Potential Index map from the USGS is one that we've used in our past work. We're currently also working with a company called Pyrogens to get some high fidelity fire potential maps as well. And basically what we do is do an overlay of our power system. So our like a GIS version of all of the transmission lines in the system. We overlay that on top of the wildfire risk map and then assign values, indices from the wildfire potential map to the lines in the power system. And you can imagine there are a lot of different ways that you can do that. For example, if a line travels through multiple zones of wildfire risk, do you take the like highest risk value, or do you like integrate the risk values along that line? So we've discussed some of that in our publication here. Okay. So this is a list of just a couple of mitigation actions that you can take to try to manage the risk of wildfire ignitions from power lines. So I like to think about it in terms of short-term mitigation strategies and long-term mitigation strategies. So in the short term, you can implement preemptive power shutoffs where you're de-energizing lines or de-energizing parts of your grid. You can also disable what's known as automatic reclosers. And so these are switches in the grid that will open up when there's an electric fault, and then they'll try to automatically reclose the circuit and re-energize it. So if you know that there's really high wildfire ignition risk in an area, you might want to disable those so you're not trying to like re-energize a line in a really risky area. And then in terms of long-term mitigation, you can implement vegetation management. You can upgrade components. So maybe like covering your conductors on the power line. You can replace poles with things that are more fire resistant. You can also convert overhead cables to underground lines. So the short-term mitigation things, those are actions that might be taken on the scale of like hours to days. Maybe you might know like a week or two in advance that you might be implementing these actions. And then in the long-term mitigation, vegetation management maybe occurs on the scale of like about months. And then the other things might take years to plan and implement. So when looking at these two things, I kind of think about the short-term mitigation as operations decisions that are made, and then the long-term mitigation strategies are more of like long-term planning decisions. And we've done some work in our lab to use mathematical optimization to try to make these operations and planning decisions. And one thing that you can do if you're making a long-term planning decision is choose a design for your grid that's optimal across many operations scenarios. So you can kind of model, say, like hourly operation scenarios or daily operation scenarios with different wildfire risk maps, different conditions for solar, wind, and load, and then choose a long-term plan that makes all of those operations scenarios more favorable. So long-term mitigation is really an attractive option because not only are you reducing the risk of igniting fires, but you're also reducing the need to implement those short-term mitigation strategies. So we may not have to implement public safety power shutoffs as much if we have a better hardened system. So in our work, we've looked a lot at like the different objectives that you might include in these optimal grid planning models. So the first thing is you might want to minimize the wildfire ignition risk from all of your power lines. Additionally, you can balance that objective with maximizing the power that you're delivering to customers. And importantly, in this work, we've included weights for social vulnerability. And so that just quantifies the ability of your customers to cope with a power outage if it does happen. And for that work, we've used the social vulnerability index from the CDC and done a similar overlay of our power system data on top of those vulnerability maps to quantify the vulnerability of each of your customers. And that is discussed more in that publication there. We also looked at a few different metrics for assessing vulnerability, and then some of our more recent work is looking into affordability of electricity, because if you're undergrounding power lines and making these really costly investment decisions, someone has to pay for it. And one option for that is to pass that cost off to customers in terms of increases in your electricity bill. So yeah, some of our work right now is looking at how we might minimize the electricity rate increases due to those costly investments. And yeah, lastly, I just want to plug this test system that we've created in our lab group. One challenge for us as researchers is that we want to like make all of our code and all of our data open source so that everyone can use it. I think our models could be really helpful for maybe electric cooperatives or municipally owned utilities that might not have the resources to develop tools in-house. So this test system is made using all publicly available data, but it does use the actual locations of the transmission and infrastructure in California. And we describe that whole process of creating that test system in our publication here. So that's all I have. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that wonderful presentation. Can the folks online hear me well? Because we have Cameron McPherson next.
Good morning. Can you guys hear me okay?
You don't have any slides, do you, Cameron?
I do not.
Okay.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, cool. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Cameron McPherson. I'm a principal manager with Southern California Edison, managing the PSPS, or Public Safety Power Shutoff, which you heard from Sofia's presentation as a short-term mitigation, last line of defense mitigation. So I manage the operations team that plans for and executes those events at Southern California Edison. I've been with the company for, I think, about 18 years now, and I've had a number of different roles across the company, from corporate real estate to customer service to transmission distribution, and now in our asset management and wildfire safety team. I've spent the past 6 years of my tenure there focused squarely on wildfire mitigation. I got to kind of kick off our targeted wildfire mitigation or expanded wildfire mitigation program at Edison in 2017, and got to help develop the first PSPS protocol, and then kind of left that department to go work on kind of advanced technology and advancing other wildfire safety initiatives at Southern California Edison, such as advanced, high fire risk area targeted inspections, advancing the technology used for them, standing up a drone program to do inspections and line patrols, and various other things. And now I'm focused on public safety power shutoff. I want to thank Sofia for a great opening presentation. Apologize, I don't have any slides, but I think Sofia set up the conversation this morning really nicely. I think I like the fact that she started off with the risk aspect, and you got to understand the risks, the ignition drivers, and the risks that you are presented with, including the consequence and what the fire might do under certain scenarios. That is extremely important for you to prioritize the mitigations that she did cover, which I think is going to be the subject of a lot of what we talk about today. To prioritize what you do, what's going to create the most value, and the time frame that you can do it under. It's extremely important for you to prioritize all of your portfolio of mitigations. I think what we've learned, there's no one silver bullet. Shouldn't rely too heavily on one thing or another. It's going to take a layered approach to mitigation, particularly in California, and other areas where the wildfire problem is definitely difficult. That's really all. And then the affordability, I want to touch on the affordability piece, and we'll talk through, I think, some of that as we talk through some of these. We got to make sure that not only our disadvantaged communities are taken care of, and I think we'll talk a little bit about microgrids. We just stood up a microgrid program to help increase resiliency in disadvantaged communities for critical energy infrastructure partners. And then affordability is really our foundational focus right now. Safety and affordability. We got to make sure there's a lot of money being spent on these mitigations. So we want to make sure that we're spending those dollars very wisely because this is very expensive work. So I'll leave it at that and just say again, thanks for the invite here to this.
Yeah, thank you, Cameron. Good talk. We're moving on to our next speaker. I don't want to pronounce your name wrong. Ray Fugere. Is that right?
Fugere, but thank you.
Yeah, close.
Hi. No worries. I don't have any slides either, but so I'll just give you a little background about myself. So my name is Ray Fugere. I'm the Director of Wildfire Safety for Southern California Edison. So I partner a lot with Cameron. So Cameron, as you mentioned, is head of our PSPS operations. When will we do that, that really short term, what we call our measure of last resort? He runs that. The other parts of wildfire mitigation that was kind of kicked off in that first proceeding fall under my shop. And I just want to talk about how we approach it, because it's a really foundational way that we think about risk. So when you think about risk and wildfire risk, we have those two sides. And this was covered earlier in that first one. You have that probability of ignition. What is that likelihood that an ignition will start at that asset? Wildfires are, there's not that many. So there's not that a large, rich data set. So what we do is we have a team of engineers on me that review every single failure we have on our system. And we're looking to see, not just for the large fires, we're looking at small fires. We're looking at events that could have turned into a fire, where you see charring on the crossarm, charring on the pole. Looking at all our failures, we take that and coupling it with all the faults we have on our system, the wire downs, and we use machine learning to develop what we call our probability of ignition models. So we have every asset. What's the likelihood it's going to start a fire? So now that we understand the likelihood from these models, we couple that with the consequence of a fire occurring. And everybody usually, when we first launched our efforts, we really focused on acres and buildings impacted, using a company called Reax, and now we switched to a company called TechnoSilva to help us drive that modeling. But we refined that a little more, and this is where it took it to another area. We looked at communities that could be trapped by a fire. So a fire could start and burn and trap a community. We realized that is very concerning to us if we trapped a community, either from the fire trapping them or our poles falling across the street so they couldn't get out. So we labeled these areas egress constraint communities. And we said, may not be as high of an acres, but could have more devastating impact to the community and the customers that we have the honor of serving. So we looked at this and we developed something we call our integration wildfire mitigation strategy. And we bucketized or subdivided our area into what we call severe risk. It's kind of those areas, where you have egress constraints. Even if we harden the system with cover conductor, we still could have to de-energize them. So those are things we really want to focus more of our attention on. Then we have another area where we call it high consequence. And what a high consequence area is, a fire could grow to 300 acres in 8 hours. And we found that's a really demarcation point, because when a fire hits 300 acres, there's a very good chance it could end up being at 10,000 plus acres at the life of the fire. And when you get to 10,000 acres, you're starting to see significant homes damaged. So we want to make sure we focus also on those areas. And then we have the last area, which we ran out of names, and we called other high fire areas. Those are those lower consequence. You're not going to see a big fire. It's not going to exceed the criteria for a PSPS. So we bucketize those areas. And so using those two variables, we started to develop our optimization for our hardening strategy. And our strategy really has these three buckets when you look at it. It's very simple. How do we make the grid more resilient to reduce the likelihood of a fault? And as mentioned, cover conductor, undergrounding, those are two keys. But there's other things: increased inspections, more thorough inspections, more detailed vegetation programs, enhancing our vegetation. We'll go into more detail on that. But then it's also responding when a negative condition occurs. I know PG&E will talk about EPSS, Enhanced Power Line Safety Shutoff. We have a very similar program that we call Fast Curve. So when a negative condition happens, how do you shut that power off faster? I equate this basically to a ground fault indicator in your bathroom, and that can reduce the energy so you can reduce the likelihood of ignition. We're also deploying what we call rapid earth fault current limiters, or REVCL. It's heavily deployed in certain states in Australia. We're using their learnings and we're starting to deploy it to our system to reduce the likelihood of ignition when a negative event happens. And then the last is what Cameron's team does a lot of: situational awareness, monitoring the system, evaluating it. Everything the PSPS team does reduces the likelihood of a fire. Because obviously if we shut off the power, there's not going to be a fire from up. But there's other things we're doing with situational awareness. We've deployed high definition cameras with machine learning to detect smoke. And this has a benefit, not just from the fires associated to us, but a benefit for any fire. Faster you find a fire, faster you get resources, better chance you can stop it from being catastrophic. So it's just kind of a background of how we're approaching wildfire safety. And myself at Southern California Edison, I look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now we're moving to our next speaker, Sandeep Aujla. I think I said that right.
Yes, good morning, everybody. It's great privilege and pleasure to be with you all this morning to discuss what San Diego Gas and Electric is doing in this space. So for those of you who don't know SDGE, it's a regulated public utility that delivers electric and gas services to roughly 3.5 million people in San Diego County and some of the adjacent Orange County in Southern California. My role at the company is I'm Director of Fire Science and Climate Adaptation. I've been with the Sempra family of companies for 10 years. Sempra is the parent company, and my roles have been in corporate strategy. I was also the lead author of SDGE's sustainability strategy that we published in 2020. I moved to climate resilience last year, where I lead a team, and you'll hear from my colleague, Chris Arends, shortly. We have a team of meteorologists, a team of fire coordinators, and folks working on climate adaptation policy, outreach and engagement that I lead. And SDGE felt the need to create a dedicated division, which actually is led by the first meteorologist that the company hired in 2009 after we had faced the brunt of 2003 and 2007 fires. His name is Brian DiAgostino, and he is now our vice president. And we also created a division under him. I lead one of the groups. The other two counterparts lead emergency management and response, and we have a dedicated team on wildfire mitigation planning. And the reason we set that up that way is because there is so much that is being discussed, from not just what we have experienced in Southern California, but also climate change and the impacts on our local populations. How do we think about climate modeling? And one of the things where I think the state has been really leading is integrating climate policies, both on the mitigation side as well as on the adaptation side. And, we are required to file our adaptation plans, not just to understand the vulnerability of our own assets and systems to climate hazards, but also the impacts of those hazards on vulnerable populations. The terminology that's used in California is disadvantaged vulnerable communities. And there is a very surgical approach on not just thinking about exposure and consequence, but really think about impacts. And so what our work also on my team requires us to work very closely with our enterprise risk groups, a lot of modeling. I'll hand it to Chris in a minute, but the importance of research and innovation and the accelerated action is something that guides us. And we have spent, I would say, the last decade learning, and we learn from every disaster. And we are told that our goal every day is to improve on that learning and make sure that ignitions in our service territory are not caused by utility. But I'll hand to Chris. Chris leads a lot of very exciting work on situational awareness, which I would say is one of our shining examples of how we address the risk. Thank you.
Thank you for the
Thank you,
wonderful
Sandeep.
presentation. Yeah, go ahead, Chris. Yeah, so you're ready to go.
Yeah. All right. Yes, ready to go. Yes, thank you, Sandeep. That was a very kind introduction. I am the meteorology manager. My name is Chris Arends. There are 5 meteorologists on staff here at SDGE, and we're really tasked with understanding fire weather, being able to predict, and then with that prediction, how do we mitigate to avoid any kind of a ignition or a fire. 5 meteorologists on staff, 3 of which have master's degrees, 1 with a PhD. We all have diverse backgrounds, so we bring a really unique perspective as a team to help forecast fire weather. And how do we do that? How do we understand the threats that are imposed on us by the dryness and the windiness that comes in the fall here in San Diego? We do have 2 high performance computing clusters. We're able to run models out 8 days at a 6-kilometer resolution. But as of this year now, we have a 1.5 kilometer resolution model that goes out 4 days. We have numerous weather variables within those computer models, and the fuels variables, which is really the key, is understanding the fuels that are involved in our backcountry. And twice a day, we issue a weather report, one at 6 in the morning and one at 12:30. The one at 12:30 really focusing on the fuels, right? Does the environment support fire? If the environment supports fire, how are we going to operate the grid differently? How are the field crews going to operate differently? And we look at, the three components to fuels. We look at the grasses, the dead fuels, the sticks on the ground that use to make a campfire. We look at the live vegetation, and we model all those components along with the weather to really understand the burnability of the environment. And then we have procedures in place so that if it is an elevated fire risk, or it's an extreme fire risk, we're going to operate differently as a company. We have 4,000 square miles. It's about 10,000 square kilometers for those in the kilometer business. And we have 222 weather stations. So we have all these weather stations similar to my other utility friends to the north. We want to know what's the weather on a circuit, so that each weather station is associated with circuit, providing us that information every 10 minutes. And during extreme conditions, we can enable 30-second weather observations, which seems insane, but it actually is very, very effective at understanding, the threat. Is that threshold being exceeded, or is it an errant gust on that circuit? Can we keep the power on a little bit longer before de-energizing that circuit and keeping the power off for safety? And we can't do a lot of these things without academic partnerships. I have to say, we work with a lot of universities. They provide us a lot of cutting edge, products and development. We work with SJSU, San Jose State University, to help us improve the fuels that go into our fire potential index. Work with Scripps Oceanography. They have a strong meteorology program there that's often overlooked because of their name. And they run a supercomputer that is a top of the line. And they provide us with a 200-member ensemble for those in the business. That's 200 different perspectives on the same problem, allowing you to get a really good, accurate mean of those 200 perspectives as to the intensity and the probability of a Santa Ana wind condition here in San Diego. Also work with the San Diego Supercomputing Center. All the visualization behind me, a lot of that is done by SDSC, taking our output from our weather, our high performance computing clusters and visualizing that data for us to allow us to really see the impending danger. And once there's a fire on the landscape, we work with the University of Wisconsin with Dr. Chris Schmidt out of SSEC. He is a world-class algorithm, takes data from the GOES 18, which is looking at the West Coast, and is able to provide us with hotspot detection in less than 5 minutes. So when there's a fire in the landscape, we know about it almost immediately, not only with the hotspot detections through Dr. Schmidt, but also we have over 100 cameras on mountaintops throughout the county looking for smoke, 40 of which are run through an AI smoke detection model. Works incredibly well. I was one of the first skeptics because I've seen this in the past where you get false alarms with coastal clouds and stratus, but these smoke detection models are state of the art these days, and they really provide us with that ability to see the fire on the landscape immediately. And with that, that's a quick overview of what we do here in meteorology. I'll kick it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
We'll move on to our final speaker, then we'll open it up for questions. Dave Canny, are you there?
I am.
Take us away.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really glad to be with you virtually along with my colleagues from Southern California. I'm going to cover a couple of slides here if I can figure out the technology. I lead our public safety power shutoff and enhanced power line safety settings program team. So should I be sharing, or are you going to cover for me?
Is this your slides right here?
That's me.
Okay,
Cool.
Yeah, I can scroll down. It's a PDF. So
Fantastic. Yeah, so I'm just going to cover the first two slides as a way to set up the conversation, and then I know we're all looking forward to the panel, so I'll be brief. If you could move to the next slide, please. So as referenced by my colleagues in California, and Cameron covered this at least at a high level, we think about mitigating wildfire risk from utility equipment through layers of protection. As Sofia set up, these are infrequent but potentially high consequence events. And so from both a situational awareness, operational mitigations, and longer term mitigations perspective, we think about multiple layers of protection. With respect to PSPS specifically, we actually just concluded an event restoring all customers last night. That event started with a scope impacting potentially 10,000 customers. And then as Chris covered, through some very advanced modeling and some granularity, both from a forecasting perspective as well as from a grid sectionalization perspective, we were able to narrow down that event to potentially impacting 5,000 customers, largely on the west side of the Sacramento Valley in California. And then eventually, ultimately shutting off power for just 1,000 customers, restoring all of those customers actually just within a few hours of the weather all clear, and in less than 24 hours from the initiation of the event. Very effective program. Sofia covered, impactful, especially for customers who are more vulnerable, those with access and functional needs, or otherwise more reliant on electricity. And so the preparation, both with those customers, as well as Office of Emergency Services and other stakeholders, is critically important to successfully executing those events. The other thing I'd like to talk about briefly from an operational mitigation perspective, and Ray set this up, if we could go to the next slide, is enhanced power line safety settings. So this is using existing protective equipment, primarily on the distribution system. We actually have EPSS enabled on some lines in the transmission system, but the primary focus is on the distribution system. Again, leveraging those existing protective equipment, primarily circuit breakers and line reclosers, but also some additional gang-operated fuse saver technology. And really, there's three main components. The first, and the one that's kind of most consistent amongst the California utilities, is faster fault detection, sensitive relay profile in San Diego Gas and Electric service area, fast curve in SCE's service area, and then in PG&E service area, which covers 70,000 square miles in Northern and Central California. This faster fault detection has two main benefits. One, it shuts off the power faster, reducing the risk of an ignition in the first place. And secondly, reduces the amount of fault energy that travels to that fault location, so that even if you do have an arc or a spark, there's less of it and less likelihood of that becoming an ignition that can propagate. What we've seen since piloting this in our service area in late July of 2021, and then rolling it out full scale in 2022, is a significant reduction both in ignitions, nearly 70% on these lines when EPSS is enabled versus the 3-year average, and a huge reduction in acres burned. So even when we do get a reportable ignition, a couple components to that, basically needs to travel more than a linear meter past our infrastructure. Those ignitions are typically less than 1/4 of an acre, so much less likely to be a fire of consequence. Two other key components, we sort of defeat, if you will, traditional protection on the distribution system by overreaching fuses. And we do that to mitigate the potential for a backfeed condition. So if you can imagine one of these wires coming down, the other two still in the air, electricity still traveling through the two in the air, backfeeding through a transformer, and then into a wire down condition that can lead to an ignition. There are reliability impacts from doing that. And so there is, at least in the short term, this trade-off between reliability and wildfire mitigation, which over time, by reducing outages, you both mitigate potential ignitions as well as improve reliability for customers. And then lastly, what was at first higher impedance fault detection. So a high impedance fault is a low current fault. This is where you have potentially a less resistant media that the conductor is on. And for traditional protection, that's very, very difficult to detect without having nuisance trips for regular voltage fluctuations on the distribution system, agricultural pumps coming online, HVAC systems, air conditioners, that kind of thing. And what we've done there is move from a higher impedance fault detection algorithm to one that is what I would consider high impedance fault detection, 1 amp for 1 second. And we have seen at least at this point 6 catches, if you will, by that technology, ignitions that almost certainly would have occurred without it, that we've mitigated. We have seen some nuisance tripping that we've been working through and looking to improve over time. So I'll just close by saying, there's one, there's a big cultural shift, particularly in California utilities, and I'd say utilities that are wrestling with wildfire risk across the U.S. and worldwide, which is for over 100 years, keeping the lights on has been the primary focus. With the increased wildfire risk, things like public safety power shutoff become necessary, and so we're fully embraced that cultural shift, and then over time looking to ensure that we are able to minimize that tool of last resort through things like undergrounding or other ways of sectionalizing the grid, such that if and when we need to use that technology, it's less impactful to customers, either through grid-based solutions or customer-side solutions. And certainly, Chris covered well the importance of not only innovation, but partnerships in particular with the university community. We partner with San Jose State as well from a meteorology and fire science perspective, and we would not be nearly as successful as we've been, in particular in the past couple of years, if not for those kinds of partnerships. So with that, look forward to the panel discussion. And again, thanks for having us here today.
Thank you. Thank you for that awesome presentation. So yeah, with that being said, we'll bring our panelists up and then we'll open the floor for questions. Does anybody have a question? Paul? Yes.
Thank you for your presentations and also what you and your team members are doing every day. Very much appreciated. My question relates to actually vegetation management, which I expect within your companies are something that is, you're confined to your right of way. And a huge part of the risk that we face occurs because of all this land that surrounds your right of way. And I'm just wondering, your thoughts on that situation and what the rest of the world, the rest of the country could do to mitigate that risk. If what sort of boundary around your right of way, if it could be better managed with prescribed burns or some other management, how much could your risk be reduced, and what are the barriers, what are the ownerships of those lands and the challenges of basically getting the fuel away from your critical infrastructure?
So thanks for that question. I can provide a few thoughts from the PG&E perspective. It's a great and important question. In California, certainly federal lands is a huge part of this equation, U.S. Forest Service and other agencies. And so forest management practices are critically important there. State lands as well. And certainly the state has started to take some significant steps in that direction, not just from a response and firefighting perspective, but also from moving towards more holistic forest management practices. And I'd say that whether it's the federal government, the state government, private landowners, our customers, that kind of interaction and partnership is critically important to mitigating that risk. I think there's a growing appreciation for the importance of use of prescribed burns as well as more holistic and comprehensive forest management practices. There is some amount, just briefly on the kind of the utility side, beyond the scope of our right-of-ways, depending on the customer, in particular larger landowners who have interest in maintaining wildfire mitigation. There are opportunities, and I'd say water districts in particular have been good partners for us in working beyond the scope, what we refer to as strike trees, so beyond the scope of the right-of-way, to ensure that we're mitigating risk.
I could take the SDGE perspective and add to what Dave was saying. So one of the things we also do is we have fire safe councils, we have wildfire safety fairs. There's a lot of community engagement around this topic of defensible space, how that mitigates and reduces fire risk for the communities that live in these high fire threat areas. and districts. We also include that in our advertising around, when we expect the Santa Ana conditions. So you'll see months in advance, SDGE will start including that in their broad marketing and advertising messages, because it's very important, right? There are things SDGE can do, but there's a lot of community action and education that needs to happen. And I would say over the years, our communities in the backcountry have a heightened awareness. So things perhaps you would have had a hard time discussing, now people are very grateful for that engagement from the utility in fire mitigation planning in their communities. It isn't easy. We are also audited on this. So, when we do have members of the community who may not want to cut down trees that we see as potential ignition risk, there is a whole procedure that's followed with local agencies to make sure, if stricter measures have to be deployed, that those can be executed as well. But we have a team of arborists at SDGE. We are also studying not just tree trimming and vegetation management, but also the species, the likelihood and the burnability of the type of tree. So we are thinking about the full impact, right? Not just removing vegetation, but also making sure we don't have the losses, the core losses from a natural system standpoint. So there is more research to come on, how we think about vegetation management and ecosystem benefits. But we do look at this not just from a wildfire mitigation standpoint, but overall ecosystem impacts as well. So if we are removing or reducing trees, we have a countermeasure on, can we help with urban heat islanding, with urban greening? Are there trees we can give away in communities where they have other issues with extreme heat? So we are always thinking about counterbalancing mitigation, adaptation with community impacts. I'll toss it over to Edison if they have comments.
Yes, thank you. So very similar for SCE as PG&E and SDGE in our approach, but I wanted to talk a little differently about this because SCE actually owns a 30,000 acre plot of forest that's surrounded by the U.S. National Forest in an area called Shaver Lake. And this is where we had the Big Creek fire emerge. So when we talk about land practices, this is very front of mind. And I just visited the location last week. When you look at how the Big Creek fire burned, it was burning very quickly towards SCE, and then it kind of stopped and went around our facilities, around the forest that we manage. And we really did a deep dive to understand what this was. To get to the point, we actively forest manage. We are doing prescribed burns every year, and we are rotating how we do that. We're actively removing dead trees, and we have a team of forest management experts that manage that land. And when you can see one of the largest fires in California's history burning so fast and quick, stopped and had to burn around the land managed, this shows that proper land management is needed to reduce wildfire. So we are managing our lands, large people around it, private companies, also individual homeowners that own lands. They're letting us now help manage their lands because it benefits us, it benefits them. So we're partnering with them. We're trying to work with the National Forest to help get them to the point as well, because as mentioned, a lot of this land is national forest, forest by the California government. So we're trying to work and partner with them because, as you said, this does reduce the risk. And it is there's a proliferation of trees when you look at some of these areas. We are looking at photos from the 1860s, 1890s, and you can see the density of the trees was very sparse in these forests. But because of our advanced firefighting technology, they're denser. So we have to figure out how to manage that risk and bring it back to a better state, because man has created some of this risk by just becoming good at fighting fires. And it seems very weird to say that we create more risk by being good at fire, but we have to figure out how to manage that. And we're starting to get better at this at SCE, and we're willing to share those practices with others.
So yeah, thanks for your interesting talks. I'm wondering, so there are mitigations options and there is this risk modeling. So I'm wondering if there is a framework to incorporate mitigation strategies into the risk modeling.
I can take a first swing at that. So if I'm understanding the question, how are we kind of looking at risk modeling and then taking that and informing our mitigation approaches, if I'm understanding correctly? And I'd say maybe with a specific example, we're now on our fourth version of our wildfire distribution risk model, which is specifically is used to inform this 10,000 mile of undergrounding initiative that we've undertaken. So that's 10,000 of our 25,000 miles of distribution, primary distribution conductor in high fire risk areas. And that risk model and the increasing sophistication of it informs where we target that particular mitigation. And then I'd say, one of the things that's a very specific way we use the distribution risk model to inform that practice and that planning effort. It's important, I think, to remember that throughout the high fire risk area, the risk of an ignition becoming consequential and damaging property or potentially causing a fatality is not a sort of linear relationship. And so the risk model, which is informed by kind of both kind of asset health and some information about wildfire risk and now egress as well, is an important way to think about where you target sort of limited resources. But some of our operational practices, like EPSS, for example, is something that we implement on a daily basis based on wildfire risk. Chris touched on the Fire Potential Index or FPI that we use to inform where we enable and disable on a daily basis. So the risk model itself informs some of the planning activities, and then the day-to-day analysis of wildfire risk from a meteorology and fire science perspective informs our operational practices, both in terms of system protection and then those activities in the field as well. Hopefully that helps at least partially answer the question.
I'll add, so very similar to PG&E. So we have risk modeling. We've had it since about 2018. We really modeled, and we keep refining. I don't know what version we're on because we have all different parts of the model created by varying data scientists. But when we talk about how we use incorporating mitigation into that risk modeling, we do. Because what we do is we do some yearly activities. So we identify what we need to inspect yearly, vegetation activities yearly. So we do take and examine, our risk models do account for mitigations deployed because it reduces that probability of ignition. So we are capturing that, and we do adjust on some of our yearly activities. Do we need to inspect this? Do we need to do enhanced vegetation inspections in this area? Or because we've done hardening, we can scale back a little on that. So we do factor those into that yearly. Now, on the long-term things, we're not using the mitigations that you get the buy down from kind of those temporary, like from PSPS, fast curve inspections. We don't use that on how we want to harden the grid. We don't account those mitigations because those are temporary. They're costly, they're temporary. So we're not using that as much in our the mitigations we deploy on an annual basis into the long-term hardening strategy. We're really looking at like overall, what's that probability of ignition if we didn't have that, because we want to switch from a, point in time, we feel good about the structure, to a permanent standpoint, either undergrounding it or installing cover conductor where we'll feel comfortable. So we're using it in some parts, but we're not incorporating the mitigations into other parts. Hope that helps.
Let's say, hold on, before you move on, did it? Okay, and you said you want to speak?
Yeah, can I just add a little bit to that? I guess in our research, we don't specifically include mitigation actions in our risk indices or our risk measures, but both the mitigation actions and the risk measures are included in our optimization modeling as objective terms, so you can kind of balance those. So for example, if you're choosing which lines in your power system to underground, we're considering both the potential for that line to start a fire as well as the importance of that line in serving load to customers. And if you include those equity weights in the optimization as well. It's serving load to vulnerable customers. So in that way, both things are included there.
Good morning. My name is Marco Bay, Executive Director of Lomacazzi Restoration Project. I had a question for Dave, but also the whole panel. So Dave, we are engaged with one of your colleagues from PG&E, Kevin Johnson, on the utility wildfire partnership side. I've heard nothing mentioned about engagement with federally recognized tribes and partnerships and accelerating those partnerships. And I'm curious of how that initiative is moving forward with all your efforts, everyone on the panel. When we think about vulnerable communities, we also think about economic development opportunities and a landscape scale approach. Somebody asked that question earlier. I think the first question asked was a great one. It's beyond your corridors. It's the landscape, Forest Service administered lands or BLM lands, and in case tribal trust lands. But those federally administered lands that are non-tribal are still ancestral lands with a strong government-to-government relationship happening on a regular basis. So in Northern California, many tribes that we work with, we've been called to the table to assist PG&E in that engagement. And I'm curious with the other panelists, how you're putting that front and center to increase utility protection, but also help vulnerable communities and make economic opportunities a part of the equation.
Yeah, thank you for that question. If you're engaged with Kevin, I assume you also know Reno Franklin, who is our lead tribal relationship principal. But if not, want to make sure you get connected. It's a fantastic question in an area that we've been certainly growing and learning in the past, I'd say, 3 to 5 years. I think we've made some progress there, but certainly more to do. So if you already know Kevin, he'll have my contact information, but please reach out to me directly, dave.canny, CANNY @pge.com. And would love to follow up with you directly, and then also make sure you're connected with Reno.
And I'd be happy to jump in for SDGE. So working with the tribes is sort of integral to our whole vulnerability analysis. So even beyond wildfire, in California, utilities are required to think about DVCs, and tribes are front and center when adaptive capacity or vulnerable populations are discussed. So our outreach and engagement, we do have a dedicated team. We have a director, Jen Summers. I don't know if you've crossed paths with her. She leads that engagement and has a team. I support that. In fact, I'm going to meet and I participate in the fairs because it's a two-way exchange, right? It's not so much utilities talking in that instance. It's more listening and understanding what that tribal wisdom and indigenous knowledge means in terms of fire preparedness and protection, and increasingly now, other climate hazards. So we are making that very much a part of our climate vulnerability assessment, outreach and engagement efforts. Wildfire is a huge part of that, but so are other climate hazards. And we are also making sure we work with the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative, and that entire SDRCC team has an equity-first approach to climate change management, adaptation, mitigation, and they have been guiding us on even the right words to use when we approach these topics, right? So there's a lot more to come, but I think this is also one of those areas where it's going to be the collective, right? What is the state doing? What's the region doing? What are local governments doing? What are utilities doing? And how are we all making sure we build that adaptive capacity locally? Send it over to Edison if they have comments.
Yeah, so we do partner with tribal governments. We believe it's necessary because it is a two-way street, as kind of was said. We have to give them information about what we are doing and actions we are taking. We also need to understand concerns that they have, also where they see vulnerability, vulnerable customers. Maybe we don't have the full site. So it is a two-way street. So we set up and send out information yearly to all our tribal governments. We express to them, like, we are willing to sit down, explain everything we're doing. We want to hear from your concerns. And so not every, tribal government takes us up on the meetings, but we send a lot of information out, we get information back, and then we also partner and have meetings to discuss the activities, to discuss if we do have to use PSPS, how will it impact you? How will it do it? We also explain all these different things that we offer customers to help reduce the likelihood, or not the likelihood, but reduce the impacts of PSPS. So we are partnering with them all because we do believe it's paramount, because we want to make sure that all our customers are safe and, you know, healthy through this wildfire season and other disasters. So we are continuously partnering with them, and we're learning just as much, I feel, as information we give them, because it is a two-way street.
Like to respond?
Yeah, just one more thing. Maybe in your presentation rollout, which you did, it was a great panel. You mentioned all your partners. It might be good to put that into your presentation rollout, that you are working with the tribes. So it elevates and it affirms that and actually strengthens that. And in addition to just consultation with the tribes, how can you move the needle on economic benefit and co-investment? How can utilities set aside dollars that fund the tribes to do the work, mitigation work, the analysis work, their bolster their natural resource department, their culture and heritage departments, and their forestry departments to be the lead partner to do that mitigation work from analysis to implementation, and not outsource that to contractors, but sole source that to the tribes in that geography and meaningfully engage those tribes beyond just a check the box partnership engagement. That's more of a statement, because my colleague next to me has been in tribal government and is whispering some things in my ear. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Marco.
Jackie Schumann from NASA. I wanted to get your perspective. This is directed at Chris, but all of you. So it sounds like you're doing a lot of research, you're using a lot of risk modeling, but what do you see as the opportunities for growth? What are the limitations? You know, we talked about fuels. Sounds like there are some targeted actions. You're working with San Jose State. So what are ways that academia or, you know, NASA technology or capabilities can help achieve, you know, better results within the wildland environment?
That's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, I think fuels is the Achilles heel to this wildfire problem. I think we're pretty good at the weather forecasting. We can get the winds, the humidity, and the temperature quite right. You know, we're down to 1.5 kilometer now resolution. We can, you know, go out 4 days pretty accurately, also with all the machine learning. But the fuels is really the tough part. You know, we're investigating. We're using NDVI from space-based low Earth orbiting satellites. They're scanning the SDGE service territory weekly at 20 different areas of interest. You know, we do have a fuel sampling program for live fuel with the U.S. Forest Service. We get live fuel moisture from them. And the dead fuels, we do model the dead fuel moistures out into the future as well. But again, it's, you know, you have varied terrain. You have, you know, areas that receive more moisture than others. We have used the NASA soil moisture database as a proxy to understand, you know, the fuel moisture in the live fuels. It's been very useful in the past, but it's a difficult problem, right? So that's really the crux of the matter is, you know, getting accurate fuel moisture data. Sure, we can model it, you know, into the future, but are we starting with good initialization on that model? I know that SCE has a really a pretty robust fuel moisture sampling program. They do they have, instead of using the Forest Service, they have their own internal vertically integrated fuel moisture sampling program, but they have a much larger area to deal with than we do. But I appreciate the question. Over to my colleagues.
I will echo the point that fuel is the Achilles heel, because right now, as mentioned, we do have a fuel sampling program, but this is involving us going out, taking samples on a routine basis to find out the, you know, 10-hour, 100-hour, 1,000-hour fuel moistures, the live fuel moistures. It's a manual effort, right? To get into that advanced modeling, we need to make this, you know, more automated, more real time. So we are working with satellite companies very similar in space to figure out how to do this in more real time, as mentioned by SDGE. But that is that Achilles heel. On the weather, winds, temperature, humidity, we have 1,600, almost 1,700 weather stations throughout our service territory, and those are almost all in our high fire areas. So we're really good at that part, but it is the fuel side we have to get better on.
Yeah, agreed.
And I'll just add, because I while I am not a meteorologist or a fire scientist. I love to hang out with them and have learned a ton working closely with them. And one of the things that we've seen in sort of this interaction between operational mitigations from a utility perspective, in particular as it relates to EPSS and enabling and disabling devices based on day-to-day wildfire risk with respect to fuels, is a challenge in the model with respect to soil moisture transference, and what it's leading to in some kind of very narrow circumstances is sort of overheated, if you will, from a kind of fuels risk perspective. And that's particularly important for us on the shoulder portions of the seasons where we're looking to make this trade-off between, in some cases, reliability and wildfire risk. And so if that's coming in and indicating kind of higher risk, we certainly need to, given our procedures and our practices, need to ensure that we are posturing the system appropriately. But as we really get into the kind of the guts, and as we look at kind of the expanded wildfire season to essentially a year-round risk in some areas, we really need to kind of continue down that path of continuous improvement and sophistication with respect to some of these really kind of nuanced aspects of the model.
Yeah, I have one more thing. Sorry, we in response to trying to improve in these areas, we've installed, as of last year, 12 new dead fuel moisture sensors for 10-hour fuels within the backcountry. Also, like I said, working with the industry and the low Earth orbiting satellites to scan weekly for the grasses, and we've also installed NDVI cameras to help validate those low Earth orbiting scans as well. So we're investigating a lot of different avenues to try and improve those fuel moistures.
For the for the lay audience, NDVI, normalized vegetation index. How much has vegetation changed?
Yeah, it's really like a measure of the chlorophyll, the health of the plant, if you will. So if NDVI, it's just a rating from 0 to 1, and it indicates really, is the plant healthy or not.
And yeah, before we go on to the next question, I'd like to throw in one myself. This is satellite focused stuff, so I would like to hear a bit about how remote sensing can enhance some of these infrastructure issues that you all have mentioned, as well as some of the mitigation factors. I know Sophie went over in her presentation. Can you speak to the resolution that we would need from a satellite or a drone type application, and how, I guess, useful at this point do you think they are?
Maybe I could start out as Cameron from Southern California Edison. That's actually what I was going to come on is we are actually starting a pilot. Our vegetation management department is starting a pilot, and we're going out to RFI and RFP for satellite vegetation management services to improve the effectiveness of our vegetation management program. I think they're looking specifically to classify species, tree health, to help optimize our program from end to end. So I think we're just etching the surface there, and we're hoping to produce some results in the coming year, maybe 12 to 18 months, I hope. And so that area is advancing. And with respect to with drones, just to give you an idea of the resolution that we're looking for at the drone level, because we have to see things like a cotter key underneath the bell of an insulator at the utility scale for detailed inspections. And so with the drone, I believe we're getting, if I recall correctly, anywhere from 2.5 to 5 millimeters per pixel, which is extremely detailed. And I think we're at 30 centimeters with best commercially available, if I recall correctly, on the satellite. So the satellite, as far as inspections is concerned, isn't scratching the itch at the moment. But I do understand that I believe our president has been, at the national level, has been talking about the access to military grade or more military grade type resolution images, so that we can start to close that gap. I pinged our DC coordinator, and he's not available today. Otherwise, I'd have some more information for you. But that has been a focus area of our president's conversations at the Edison Electric Institute.
Well, this has been a really great discussion. We're going to have I'm not ending the discussion now, this particular line. this issue of, what scale do we need to observe on, an integrated observing system. At the end of this conference, we're going to have a chance to circle back. I think this is one of the key ones where we can see some growth. So let's keep our thoughts about this going, and then let's circle back to start discussing this again in the closing section. We did have a few more, and I don't mean to deter the talk. I'd like to make sure we continue it in the future, but we had a few more questions.
Hi, I'm John Schreck. I'm a machine learning scientist here at NCAR. You asked about, or somebody kind of brought up remote sensing. We have models here already that they're pretty new, where we can use VIIRs as inputs to a machine learning model, for example, which is 375 meter resolution, and we get pretty good performance at being able to predict 10-hour dead fuel moisture. We have models that do live as well. They're a little bit less sensitive to the satellites. That's not the only thing that we have as inputs to the model, but it's more of like a comment, really. Like, if you could get us lower resolution data, I don't know about like millimeter for machine learning, but something sub 375, it's probably fairly promising that like we could model something like that. So maybe I came in late. I don't know if you talked about machine learning applications already, but yeah, just kind of putting that out there.
Panel wanted to respond to that at all?
Sorry, I was in consultation with my PhD. Yeah, John, thanks for the question. That's really interesting. Actually, I'd love to get your contact information after this panel discussion today. We use machine learning for wind gusts mainly. We don't have a machine learning dead fuel moisture model, but that sounds like something I'm always interested in the latest initiatives that are going on. But as far as machine learning, yeah, we've trained our model on previous Santa Ana events, and it's actually quite accurate at predicting the peak gusts, the time, and the date of those peak gusts on all 222 weather stations that are associated with the circuit. But yeah, like I said before, the fuels is always the mystery, right? We're pretty good at estimating the fuel, the burnability, the environment, but getting better information is always top of mind for me.
Again, any of those machine learning models need actual data to train on. So it does come back to making sure we've got measurements at the appropriate scale. Any other questions?
This might be more for Sofia. I was kind of wondering, thinking about your equity analysis and bringing in the vulnerability index. You're talking about that in terms of who's at risk with a power shutoff. I was wondering if you know of people using that for seeing who's at risk for the fires themselves, and like which communities to target for those interventions and reducing the fuel.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that's a really important point, and something that we haven't dove into quite as much just because it's really hard. But I think that's something like the vulnerability to wildfires is a factor that definitely could be included in the optimization models that I've been talking about. So maybe like in quantifying the risk of the wildfire risk of each power line, you could include a weighting factor for the vulnerability of the community surrounding that power line location. But then there's questions of like, like where exactly would that be? And that will also depend on the local topology, the terrain, the vegetation, and everything. So yeah, I think the vulnerability to fires is definitely an important part, but we haven't specifically looked at that. I'd definitely be interested to hear if any of the utilities are thinking about that in their risk measures as well.
Yes, I can jump in here. So we are required to look at, as I said, vulnerable communities, and wildfire is one of the climate hazards. And there is a whole order instituting rulemaking in California called Climate Adaptation OIR. As part of the Climate Adaptation OIR, it's two-pronged. You've got to file your community engagement plans a year in advance of your risk filings, and then your entire vulnerability assessment of the system and the communities you're serving a year after that. Now, when we engage with communities, we also need to share the data on vulnerability. So one of the things we've been asked to do is map using CalAdapt's platform, the various scenarios. And when the rulemaking started, it was under RCP 8.5. Worst case scenarios, it's quickly shifting to the shared socioeconomic pathways. And, there is a phase 2 of that rulemaking that's going on at the moment at the regulatory level. But the idea is to think about future scenarios of climate. And we have timescales, I think it's 35, 50, 70, and play forward what these, I think we study 6 hazards, wildfire is one of them, but we're also looking at extreme temperatures, sea level rise, cascading risks, flooding, and what does that look like across our service territory? And once we've mapped that risk of vulnerability, which again, for us is a calculation around exposure to the climate hazard, and then the adaptive capacity or the sensitivity to that exposure to get to the vulnerability. But what we are doing is, as we are compiling that data, we are sharing that with our CBOs. The goal is to engage with local communities, including tribes, with that information. And the standard platform right now on that is CalAdapt for California. But this is an active area of research for us in learning and engagement. And also our cities are working on this, right? So the city of San Diego has its vulnerability plan, and they're studying this. All major infrastructure projects are required to study what these climate scenarios mean for their investment. Where we need more help, I think, is on translating these exposures and sensitivities and vulnerabilities into impacts. How do you measure the impact on the particular community that has lower adaptive capacity to then help prioritize the needs of that community? That's an area where we need help in terms of what's the right way of looking at it, right? Today we look at safety for reliability. We have safety measures, we've got financial measures, but for climate equity, coming up with the right measure of value of the economic impacts, the health impacts, is really hard. So if you have thoughts on that, please reach out to us. But that's how we are thinking about vulnerability analysis and community impacts. I don't know if other members of the panel have ideas. But that's how SDGE is thinking about it.
Yeah, maybe I'll just mention from specifically from a PSPS perspective, and the decision to use it during event, whether or not the benefits outweigh the impacts. We utilize, and I believe the other utilities do as well, what we term the in-event risk calculator, which does measure the impact on specifically on the AFN community. So I believe that we adequately take that into account, but there's always improvements that can be made, and we're always looking for ways to improve that calculation methodology.
Yeah, I would just also add, in looking at different measures to assess vulnerability, I think it's really important when you're using like these kind of publicly available vulnerability metrics, such as the Social Vulnerability Index from the CDC, and there's a range of others, and a lot of them use census data and different like kind of categories of census data, different kind of underlying indicators. So for example, the Social Vulnerability Index includes factors for like your minority status, your income, possession of a vehicle, possession of a high school diploma, a range of different factors. And I think it's really important to consider this range of factors in assessing social vulnerability, because some of those factors may directly impact your ability to cope with a power outage or a wildfire, but then there are others that have such an indirect effect on that ability. So it's important to have like a general measure of vulnerability. I think also it's just important to carefully consider each of those underlying factors, because you might want to choose a slightly different metric to assess vulnerability to power outages versus to wildfires. So for example, one factor might be dependence on a electrically powered medical device, which would be important if there's a power outage. But the considerations for wildfires are totally different there. So you might want to kind of just shift the metric slightly. And then I also mentioned the affordability when we have these costly investments for grid resilience, and those costs are potentially passed off to customers, and we want to pass those off to customers in an equitable way. That measure of being able to pay for your electricity bill is also going to be a totally different metric of ability to pay, I guess, in that case. So yeah, it's great that we have these publicly available tools for assessing social vulnerability, but we should consider the underlying indicators there as well.
All right, we can do one more. Oh, cool. Yeah. Because we're running into the break, so you're making people upset.
I just want to applaud you for pointing that out, because another factor to take into consideration in these decisions in wildfire prevention and whatnot is when you decide to allocate costs at what time. So you have blue collar workers who can't afford to do laundry midday or in the morning. They have to go to work. So when they come home, that's when they do their laundry. And that's when power costs the most if you're trying to mitigate ways in which to prevent wildfires or distribute your energy. So I just want to echo that.
Thank you. And I have one request from Ray and from Sandeep. You've mentioned integrated wildfire mitigation strategy that you published, and also a sustainability strategy. I'm assuming those are publicly available. If they are, could you possibly put the link to those in the chat so that we can capture those? Thank you.
You to do that, yes.
Yes.
Okay, and with that, we conclude this session. So now we'll be moving to our coffee and networking break. And then after that, we'll return for our early career flash talks, as well as everyone gather all your thoughts. We will have a riveting discussion at the end of this. Oh yeah, sorry. Thanks. Thank you, Paul, for correcting me there. Appreciate all lovely speakers. We appreciate it. See you folks at 10:45. That's Mountain Time.
Thank you all. Pleasure being here. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.